Thank you very much, everyone doing service, making the meeting possible. My name is Andy, and I'm a very grateful, recovered, definitely not cured alcoholic. And first of all, for anyone that doesn't know me, quick potted history. First drink at 13, first AA meeting at 23, but the distance between my first AA meeting and my second one was about 28, 29 years. It took me a long time to get this. I finally got this 2 years, 7 months and change ago. And to say that this program has immeasurably changed and saved my life would be a ludicrous understatement. I am not a big book expert. I'm not an expert on anything. All I am is an alcoholic who has been through this program and who has fallen in love with this big book and spends a lot of time reading and studying it because it is a textbook, as we'll find out. The person that turned up in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous 2 years, 7 months ago had nothing any of you would have wanted and nothing to offer. So it genuinely is such an honour and a privilege to be asked to do this, because I really, when I got here, boy, I wasn't any use to anybody. So we're reading for the 4th edition of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And when you open the big book up, there's a big blank page, and then the very next one, there's just the words Alcoholics Anonymous, and on that page I've got 2 things written underneath mine. These are things that I've picked up in the time I've been in the rooms. One, I wrote underneath, if you don't know what you're joining, how do you know you want to join? I got that from a fellow in the rooms. And the other thing I've got written on that page is, you cannot outgrow this program. And that's something I heard someone say, and it's something that I like to be reminded of. That's why I wrote it on my cover page. Then we flip over and we see Alcoholics Anonymous, and we see the story of how thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. And that really is the hope that this book is going to offer, because it's talking about how thousands have recovered. We're going to go skip past the contents page for a moment and turn to the preface or preface of the book on page XI. And it says, this is the 4th edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. The first edition appeared in April 1939, and in the following 16 years more than 300,000 copies went into circulation. The second edition, published in 1955, reached a total of more than 1,150,500 copies. The third edition, of which came off the press in 1976, achieved a circulation of 11,698,000. Because this book has become the basic text for our society, and I've got those words basic text underlined in my book, this is a textbook. Tells us that right there, has become the basic text of our society and has helped such large members of alcoholic men and women to recovery. There exists a strong sentiment against any radical changes being made in it, and there still is that sentiment today. Therefore, the first portion of this volume describing the AA recovery program, the first portion being the first 164 pages of the book, and in my book, it says, has been left untouched. In your book, it might say, especially if you've got an American edition of the 4th edition of the Big Book printed after 2006, you will have the word largely in there. It will say left largely untouched. I don't know why it hasn't filtered down to the British printings, because mine's a 20th edition, printed in 2000-something, and mine doesn't have the word largely in it. It was a thing that was voted through at conference in America, because they decided that saying just left untouched wasn't strictly speaking true. There have been a number of minor editorial changes, mainly grammatical corrections and things made to the first 164 pages since the first edition was printed. And if you want to know what they are, you can go to silkworth.net, which fully documents them all. But none of them change any meaning or anything significant in the book. They were just done for clarification or to improve grammar on the whole. In the course of the revisions made for the 2nd, 3rd and 4th editions, the section called The Doctor's Opinion has been kept intact, just as it was originally written in 1939 by the late William D. Silkworth, late because he died in 1950, our society's great medical benefactor. The 2nd edition added the appendices, and if you look over to the contents page opposite, you will see that the appendices are listed out there. There were 7 of them added. The 12 traditions and the directions we're getting in touch with, but the chief change was in the section of personal stories, which was expanded to reflect the fellowship's growth. Bill's story, Dr. Bob's Nightmare, and one other personal history from the first edition were retained intact. 3 were edited and one of these was retitled. New versions of the 2 stories were written with new titles. 30 completely new stories were added, and the story section was divided into 3 parts under the same headings that are used now. In the 3rd edition, Part 1, Pioneers of AA, was left unchanged. 9 of the stories in Part 2, They Stopped in Time, were carried over from the 2nd edition. 8 new stories were added. In Part 3, they lost nearly all. 8 stories were retained and 5 new ones were added. And then the 4th edition includes the 12 concepts for world service and revises the 3 sections of personal stories as follows. 1 new story has been added to Part 1, and 2 that originally appeared in Part 3 have been repositioned there. 6 stories have been deleted. 6 of the stories in Part 2 have been carried over. 11 new ones have been added and 11 taken out. Part 3 now includes 12 new stories, 8 were removed in addition to the 2 that were transferred to Part 1. And if you want to know where all those stories are that were taken out, moved and whatever, in 2000 something or the other, when was it? I'll have a look. 2002, General Conference approved the printing of a book called Experience, Strength and Hope. And in that book you will find all the stories from the original editions that have been removed or changed from the big book. But it goes on to tell us why those stories were removed, and if you have the book Experience, Strength and Hope, you've read some of them, you'd see why. Because a lot of them are very samey, generally a lot of middle-class white men getting sober. All the changes made over the years in the big book, AA's members' fond nickname for this volume, have had the same purpose: to represent the current membership of Alcoholics Anonymous more accurately and thereby to reach more alcoholics. So that's why we've changed the stories and why they get updated, and we will in time have a 5th edition which will probably have stories of how people have got sober online using conferencing programs like this one. If you have a drinking problem, we hope that you may pause in reading one of the 42 personal stories and think, yes, that happened to me. Or more important, yes, I felt like that. Or most important, yes, I believe this program can work for me too. And that's also a really good illustration of why we share in meetings, because in the sharing of our stories that people see the similarities. And that's why we have a total of 43 stories in our beautiful big book. We have the 42 that are printed in the back, and we have Bill's story, which makes up chapter 1. So we've got 43 personal stories in total. And that's for good reason, because so many of the times that's where we first find out, we find that identity. Okay, so then we're into the foreword to the 1st edition, and it says, "This is the foreword as it appeared in the first printing of the 1st edition in 1939. We of Alcoholics Anonymous," and in one opening half a sentence they've pointed out straight away this is a book that is derived from multiple authors. Although we know that Bill Wilson wrote the majority of it, and we know that other people, it was the first 100 did a lot of editing, tweaking, tuning, discussing back and forth, and which our AA history books are full of all the details on that. But from the get-go, this is a group publication. It represents the more than 100 men and women who have recovered, and it uses that word from the get-go. We have recovered from what? A seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of these books. For them, we hope these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. We think this account of our experiences will help everyone to better understand the alcoholic. Many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person, and besides, we are sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. And I just love, there is so much just in that first opening paragraph. I love that the forward to the first edition doesn't beat around the bush. It tells us what it is, and it goes straight away. You know, I hear people sometimes say, I'm never going to call myself recovered, I'll always just be recovering. Well, that ain't what the book says. And if you've done what the book says, and you've been through the steps the way the book says, and the book says you have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. It is important that we remain anonymous because we are too few at present to handle the overwhelming number of personal appeals which may result from this publication. Being mostly business or professional folk, we could not well carry on our occupations in such an event. We would like it understood that alcoholic work is an avocation being effectively like a hobby, something you don't do for money, you don't do full time. And there's a good reason for that. It stops big shotism, doesn't it? And that's a very important thing, and why our traditions and everything make a very clear point that we should never be paid for our 12-step work and stuff like that. When writing or speaking publicly about alcoholism, we each of our fellowship to omit his personal name, designating himself instead a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Very earnestly we ask the press also to observe this request, for otherwise we shall be greatly handicapped. We are not an organisation in the conventional sense of the word. And now you'll recognise some of this as I read it. There are no dues or fees whatsoever. The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. We are not allied with any particular faith, sect or denomination, nor do we oppose anyone. We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted. And that obviously is a lot of what we hear in our AA preamble today. The word honest was dropped from the preamble in 1958 for a couple of reasons. Someone brought up at General Conference that it's not mentioned in the third tradition. And somebody also said, how do we know what honest is? It's very difficult to quantify what an honest. And I'll tell you what, when I got to the rooms of AA, I thought I was an honest person, but I wasn't. I didn't know how to be honest. I told myself so many lies and believed them and then recited them as if they were true. I didn't realise I was lying, So, when I got here, I just about had a desire to stop. I don't know how honest it was, so I'm glad that they did remove that from the preamble because it certainly meant I qualified. And if you want to get into the full history of the AA preamble, which is fascinating, there's a great little leaflet that AA has on the aa.org website. It's handily titled SMF-127. And if you search for that on aa.org, it will bring up the background information on the AA preamble. A very interesting read. Oh, also there, incidentally, is the first pointing out that we're not allied with any sect denomination, which I think is a really important part of the programme. I wouldn't have stuck around if I thought it was. We shall be interested to hear from those who are getting results from this book, particularly from those who have commenced work with other alcoholics. We should like to be helpful in such cases. And yet they realised even back then that it was important to get sober, but it was almost more important to pass it on, and that's what they were looking for, the people that were passing it on. Inquiry by scientific, medical and religious societies will be welcomed, and I love that. AA was never one of these organisers that said, we know what we're talking about. We've always been open to science, medical and religious things, and we welcomed their input and welcomed what we could learn from them. And then that foreword is signed again by the whole of Alcoholics Anonymous, as it was back then, that first 100 or so men or women that started this beautiful programme off. Where are we on time? We're okay. I'm going to do a few more minutes. We'll make a start on the foreword to the second. We are not going to get through the foreword to the second edition because there is a lot in here, but we'll make a start on it. The figures given in this foreword describe the fellowship as it was in 1955. And if you join us late, we're on page XV, no Roman numerals, foreword to the second edition. Since the original foreword to this book was written in 1939, a wholesale miracle has taken place. Our earliest printing voiced the hope that every alcoholic who journeys will find the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous at his destination. Already continues the early text, 2s and 3s and 5s of us have sprung up in other communities. 16 years have elapsed between our first printing of this book and the presentation in 1955 of our second edition. In that brief space, Alcoholics Anonymous has mushroomed into nearly 6,000 groups whose membership is far above 150,000 recovered alcoholics. Groups are found in each of the United States and all of the provinces in Canada. AA has flourishing communities in the British Isles, Scandinavian countries, South Africa, South America, Mexico, Alaska, Australia and Hawaii. All told, promising beginnings have been made in some 50 foreign countries and US possessions. Some are just now taking shape in Asia. Many of our friends encourage us by saying that this is but a beginning, only the augury of a much larger future ahead. An augury is like an omen or a sign, so a sign of what was to come. And isn't it a miracle? In 16 years is not a long time, right? You know, if I look at my life, I spent double that out drinking. 16 years is not a long time, and in that short space of time, this thing from humble beginnings that started with this manuscript, this early book being passed around, and then these early meetings forming, and we grew in that time, in that much. It just shows that there had to be something bigger and better than us guiding us, doesn't it? The spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck in Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker, that's Bill, and an Akron physician, which is Bob Smith. 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend, that was Ebby T, who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day. So, the person that comes to see Bill and Bill's story is Ebby Thatcher, and this is the first mention of the Oxford groups, which is partly where a lot of the initial ideas for what formed our steps was born out of. And for those that aren't aware, the Oxford group was a Protestant movement founded by a guy called Frank Buchanan, who was a Lutheran minister, and Sam Shoemaker, who you will have seen referenced in the 12 and 12 if you've read that, who was an Episcopalian. Quite a good mix, isn't it? And they started this group called the Oxford Group, which was a religious group, really, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we go. He had also been greatly helped by the late William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism who is now accounted no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose stories of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. From this doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism. Though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford group, he was convinced of the need for moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. And if you do a little bit of digging, I've done what research I could. There are some historians that say that the Oxford group had up to 28 tenets of faith. The main ones they talked about, though, were they had a key fourth thing, and then which I can't remember the name of, the four absolutes, and then they had the 5 C's. And the 5 C's were confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, and continuance. And when you actually look what the steps were built out of, it's that. And if you want to see what they say were the original 6 steps of the Oxford group, or what they formed out of the 5 C's, really, you can turn to page 263, and one of the stories in the big book, it lists them out there. So Bill couldn't get on board with everything that the Oxford group said, and if you dig into that, you'll see why. Very religious organisation, had some very good beliefs, some very strange ones, but it didn't matter. He could see that there was a power because they were helping people with a drinking problem by providing a spiritual solution, and the core of that spiritual solution was in that becoming convinced that you needed it, taking moral inventory, confessing it to someone else, then putting right those you had harmed, and then and belief in the dependence upon God. And you can see that obviously the early people found they couldn't stay sober using those first 6 steps, and that's really where the 12 steps developed out of. And we will go on to read more about that next week, because that is my time